Operated for decades before it was closed in 2015 for hazardous waste violations. But the impact on those who live near here is still being felt. Prenatal and early childhood exposure to lead.
I don't think enough is being done.
This is a critical component to a long fight that we've had in our community for 30 years. I'm not someone who has to imagine raising a child in that community. There is a mask that my child wears.
Spread lead dust to an area of about 100,000 people. That a company that's responsible for the pollution had to close its plant down because of it gets to walk away without taking care of it.
Soil contamination is defined as being a type of pollution where the presence of toxic chemicals in soil are in high concentrations, making it a risk to human health and ecosystems. According to the American Pediatrics Association, soil is contaminated by lead particles from flaking lead paint, incinerators, other sources that are similar, vehicles that use lead, gasoline, and car batteries since they become deposited into the soil. Urban areas are ones that are most affected by soil contamination because they receive higher dispositions of lead that come from factories and vehicle emissions.
Now, to give a bit of history, the battery recycling facility that became Exide Technologies was first opened in Vernon in 1922. It was one of the 2 lead-acid battery recycling facilities that was located west of the Rocky Mountains. Exide Technologies acquired it in 2000 when it was operating under a temporary permit that the state granted in 1981. Additionally, because the facility was considered to be a smelter, it underwent heavy regulations due to the amount of dangerous pollutions that it exerted, such as lead and cancer-causing arsenic. However, even though that was the case, Exide's Technologies and its predecessors, GNB, received a number of violations that were swept under the rug. In 2015, when Exide Technologies was forced to close due to California's Public Records Act, DTSC's oversight of Exide was in detailed of pages that highlighted all the violations that people were unaware of. Exide Technologies has been closed for 5 years now and has not been demolished, but rather enclosed by a tent-like structure that was designed to prevent the release of leaves and other pollutants.
Environmental racism has played a leading role in the detriment of the general health of low-income, marginalized communities for decades. Impoverished, vulnerable communities are predisposed to the exposure of toxic waste and industrial pollution, as the individuals in these communities with low socioeconomic status are easier to exploit and are systemically undervalued.
The people of these communities are the ones being poisoned from these big companies that are corrupted by greed and profit, and it has led people to voice their concerns on their livelihoods.
But it was because of a man that worked near Exide. He noticed that there was a dust, a filament on top of his car, and he couldn't figure out where this dust was coming from. He had it tested, and it was lead. It was lead coming out of Exide.
When lead is released into the air from industrial sources, it may travel long distances before settling down into wherever it lands. As you might have guessed, the closer you are to the facility which is producing this contamination, it is more apparent.
We were able to get our home tested, and we found elevated levels of lead, in particular in the drip zone. The drip zone is when it rains, the water that falls off of your roof.
In 2014, the DTSC created the Removal Action Plan to replace all of the soil that was found to have elevated levels of lead in a 1.7-mile radius from Exide Technologies. To give some insight on the procedure, as of May 14 of this year, 2,578 properties were cleaned, meaning that only about 26% of the total properties that were tested are now clean. Companies, politicians, and those with higher socioeconomic status trade human health for profit. An example of this can be Exide's decision to willfully place low-income people of color at risk of developing harsh health issues. The system has once again failed its marginalized citizens for allowing Exide to face no consequences for the damage it has caused, and neither has it enforced mandatory cleanups for the general well-being of those affected.
So I want to go a little bit deeper, specifically how has it affected you?
Well, it's taking a lot of energy, to go to these meetings. It is really, most of the stuff is very high technical things. This is why we have the specialists like Dr. Wells to guide us through this. And, but it's very tedious to listen to all the reports. And I can tell you that I keep hearing the same things, the same promises over and over. And it's just like a slow torture almost to say.
Children preschool aged and fetuses have a higher chance of receiving lead poisoning since their developing nervous systems are sensitive to lead. They play in areas that are full of dirt, and their deficiencies of absorbing iron and calcium facilitate lead absorption and taking the toxins into their bodies. Lead poisoning in children can cause much more catatonic and life-lasting effects compared to that of an adult. Although Exide's effect on children can't be fully resolved, there are steps that can be taken to limit lead exposure. According to the County of LA Public Health, eating a diet high in iron and calcium may decrease a child's lead absorption. Keeping your home dust-free by wet mopping and wet wiping surfaces, and covering areas of bare soil outside your home with grass, bark, wood chips, or gravel can help control lead exposure.
I can remember a young man whose brains were very severely damaged, and then his stomach was all messed up, and his family believes that it's because of the lead pollution, because he lives, as far as we know, this particular young man is, when I first met him, I think he was about 20-something. He is the closest family that lives to the factory, and the family believes that the closeness to that factory, the Exide people, caused him these illnesses.
The state inspections that Exide was subject to once a year showed that a problem was recorded at every inspection. For example, one of the problems highlighted was that they found lead and acid leaks from a pond that was overflowing with toxic sludge and lead dust that was found in nearby soil, streets, and businesses. However, they weren't subject to extreme punishment since the state considered them to be Class 1 violations that are described by the department as being ones that do not require enforcement action since they don't appear to have a serious threat to human health or the environment. It wasn't until 2008 and 2013 when the department noticed that the problems became more serious. In 2008, the department sampled roofs in neighboring businesses, streets, and soil that was outside of Exide and found lead concentrations of up to 52,000 parts per million, which is 50 times the regulatory limit of hazardous waste. The DTSC deemed it as a threat and therefore ordered that Exide take cleanup measures. Exide furthered health threats in 2013 when inspectors found leaking trailers that stored hazardous lead acid battery waste, which Exide themselves knew was considered a felony. They also at the same time similarly found hazardous levels of lead on the streets out of Exide and in the workers' parking lot. Other noted problems that were later found were holes in the facility's walls and roof during January 2016, a year after their forced closing.
Well, my mom and my grandma actually toured the Exide site. And the Exide site was tore up. It looked really bad from the outside. And it was an emitter of lead. It was recognized as that. And so they had identified this as a problematic site, right? And there was some interest politically and from state agencies to deal with the issue. And then folks shifted around. That's what happens a lot. Elected officials move to other positions, agency staff move to other agencies, and the willingness to address issues sometimes is lost that way.
In October of 2020, Bankruptcy Court ruled that Exide Technologies will have the ability to abandon its battery recycling plant in Vernon, leaving the cleanup of lead and many other pollutants to California taxpayers. This decision was made by Chief Judge Christopher Sanchi of the U.S. Bankruptcy Court of Delaware after a 2-day court hearing that was full of testimonies from environmental regulators, company consultants, officers, and health experts that expressed that Exide Technologies facility was and continues to be a threat to the public and the environment. Still, the judge ruled that the facility is not an imminent threat to communities.
Mismanagement of Exide is why any of this happened. Mismanagement of dealing with Exide even after they closed is why Exide was able to file for bankruptcy and not have to pay any more for any cleanup. They don't exist anymore, but the contamination is still here.
California has recently refused to sign a settlement that would give the state $2.6 million in exchange for a release from liability, since they had already set aside $270 million towards cleaning homes that were surrounded by contaminated soil. If California had agreed, the rented property would have been put under an environmental trust that would have all the contamination cleaned up faster than it has been going.
As authored and passed by Assemblymember Miguel Santiago, Assembly Bill 118 ensures all residential properties, schools, daycare centers, and parks within a 1.7-mile radius of Exide are tested. With that being said, on Assemblymember Santiago's website, there are a series of steps people can take to sign up for soil testing and eventually get their contaminated soil removed and replaced. The only other resources provided by the LA County is a free and confidential blood lead test and various tips on lowering the risk of lead exposure, from taking off your shoes before you enter your home to mopping floors instead of dry sweeping.
It's important for folks to recognize that this might be the first time you hear about Exide. We want you to know that this is your fight, because this is still an issue in our community. And if this is the first day you find out about it, then this is the first chance you have to get involved.
If you are concerned about environmental health in East or South Los Angeles, please support the East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice. It's a community-based organization that advocates for a healthy quality of life and helps community members exercise their voice against industrial pollution.
Exide is only one issue, man. There's so many issues in our communities. So we invite you to get down with East Yard at EYCEJ on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, or go to our website, eycej.org. Or really get involved with any group. Start your own group, like whatever, just do something that contributes to the betterment of our community.